Hello and welcome back to the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host Tom Mason, and today we continue our small mini series on sculpting guns. Last time we learned how to sculpt pistols, and this time we're going to focus on larger weapons, specifically rifles. So in this particular tutorial, I'm going to show you how to sculpt a sci-fi rifle, but all these techniques can be used for sculpting any sort of guns, modern weapons, ancient rifle weapons, I don't know, your muskets, things like that. But it's really helpful. The techniques I'm going to show you here are really helpful when you want to do something a little bit bigger and bulkier, where you have to have lots of little intricate details. All right, let's get on with the tutorial. The Mini Sculpting Super Show is powered in part by Sculpt Toys. See everything they have to offer at sculptomotoys.com. The first thing you're going to need to do when sculpting rifles is to make the armature. Now, I suggest using a brass rod, and in this case, the length will completely depend on the size and shape of the rifle you're going to make. But what I recommend when doing a large rifle is using brass rods. I use a brand called K&S Precision Metals, and I'll use one of two sizes. For this gun, I used a 3/64 inch or 1.19 millimeter diameter rod. You can also use a 0.032 inch or 0.81 millimeter rod. Those ones, the smaller one is great if you are using something that will have barrels that are exposed and showing, because that's a good thickness. It can still cast. You might want to beef it up just a little bit, but it will work. Whereas the larger size that I used for this one is better when you're just going to use a whole, just have it as a main frame, the kind of just something for the putty to attach to. I'm using a mix of Greenstuff and Aves Apoxie Sculpt, which is what I usually do whenever I'm doing any sort of weapon or equipment that I'm going to have to file. And it's basically just 25% of all four of those parts. Very easy. So you just mix it up, and you want to spread a little bit of lubricant. I'm using petroleum jelly on these are just ceramic tiles. They were great for flattening out putty without getting nice flat and crisp shape. Just massage it down, and it's okay. You want this to be a little bit thick because it will be. You can always file it down later, but once you get that done, and while it's still wet, go ahead and use a sharp hobby knife and very gently score the putty and just trim it down. Try and make the shape roughly what you're gonna want in the end. This will save you a ton of time as you go forward, since filing can be take a lot of time, and it's very easy to overdo it. So if you go ahead and get a lot of your shape roughed in this way when the putty is still soft and wet, that can save you a lot of time in the end. You just want to make sure you're being very careful to just very gently and slowly trim this away, because if you're a little too aggressive, you can start to pull the putty off of the brass armature wire. But if you just make sure your tool has enough lubricant on it and you're checking your measurements and just slowly cutting it away, everything will turn out great. Now that I've got the basic shape of my rifle cut in, I went ahead and set this aside for a while in a putty oven, or you can just set it aside, but I like using a putty oven because the heat will increase the curing time. Sorry, it decreases the curing time. It'll make it cure faster. And anytime that I'm going to work on anything that has to be filed or cut and needs to have a real sharp edge, I always like to hit it with the heat of a putty oven or something, rather than just letting it cure naturally, because it always seems to get just a little bit harder and more fully cured when you do it that way. So now that it's fully cured, I'm going over it with a hobby knife, a file, and now a Dremel tool. Dremel, I like to use this kind of in the initial stages just to really knock it down fast, a little more into shape. You can do this all with files. It just takes a lot longer, but I wouldn't recommend using the Dremel once you kind of are getting much closer to the final shape, because it's very easy to trim off way too much material. So just kind of do it for your very large elements and shapes that you know are going to be there, and then go back in with a set of needle files or even your hobby knife and start trimming things away. The main files I use, they're just standard typical small needle files you can get at pretty much any hobby shop, but I like using a very large flat file, which you can see me using right now. That's just great for hitting broad areas, but you can still have a lot of control and finesse. And the other one I really like to use is a small rounded one. You can use a large one too, but usually when I'm doing the rounded shapes, it's in pretty small areas. And you can also use a small flat file as well. Again, you know, if you're getting into smaller nooks and crannies, the bit large one's just going to be too big. So, but at this stage, we're not trying to add any detail with this yet. We're really just trying to basically find the final profile of the gun. And there might be some slight variances with that in the end as you sculpt on extra details, but for the most part, this base shape we're making should be a perfect side view silhouette of what the gun, the rifle, will ultimately be. I'm getting pretty close to the final shape that I want for this gun. As you can see, it's a very large, bulky object, and so it's, you know, you're going to constantly have to go back and do slight little modifications, but I'm not going to have to worry about any things like having a barrel, really, because it's all kind of encased in various kind of housings and whatnot. One thing to be aware of, though, as you're filing is you might notice that the armature is basically just going down the length of the gun, so there's nothing holding no armature in the actual handle itself. So you need to be very careful when you're filing this. It's very durable material, but if you're not careful and you're not thinking about it, you could potentially snap that off. So just be mindful when you're working around that area and know that it's just putty just hanging there. There's nothing, no extra support. I'd also recommend keeping a ruler handy and make sure you are checking your measurements regularly. You don't want to make this thing too small or too short. It's very easy to do that. You know, have your miniature ready if nothing else, and have it nearby, and hold the gun into position kind of where it's going to go, and make sure it looks like it's going to fit where it needs to fit on the model. I think that's actually one reason I don't care for sculpting weapons and little pieces of equipment as much, is when I'm sculpting, I like to work the whole miniature. And when you're making a piece like this, there's very solid defined stages that you have to go to, and you have to, you know, do it from start to finish. I noticed it was a little bit too thick, so I went ahead and trimmed it down some, because we're going to add some details here in just a second, and if I didn't trim this down, it would be too thick. Now that we're done with the easy part, it's time to move on and sculpt the actual details. For this stage, you can use any putty you want: ProCreate, Greenstuff, a mix of ProCreate and Aves. I believe on this I'm using ProCreate with just a little bit of Aves mixed in. That way it's a little bit easier to sand if I need to, and that's actually just a blend that I kind of prefer. So I usually do details on a gun in two major stages. And I also focus on one side at a time, and separated by the two stages. So basically, I lay down a large flat amount of putty, spread it out into the general shape of the detail that I want to start sculpting, and smooth it out, make it nice and smooth and even. And as you're spreading this out, you want to go ahead and trim pieces down, you know, try and get the general shape for the major areas and details you're going to have on the gun. So that's why it's not sitting entirely to the edge there in the back that you can see. Now on the front, you'll notice that some of the putty had spread off the edge, and what you do there is you get a very sharp blade like a Scalpel or an X-Acto, and just very carefully and slowly, just smoothly trim it off, and that will allow you you to match up to the edging that you created earlier with the base form. Now, a second ago you saw me kind of set it down and pick it back up. Well, I actually after you get the putty all spread out and have just kind of the major general shape, it's a good idea to let it sit for 5, maybe even 10 minutes, because that just gives the putty a chance to set up just a little more. It won't be as warm from being kneaded in your hand, and it will help it not be quite as gummy and hold its shape a little bit better. So once you do that, you can go in and cut out little extra shapes, create more forms, and when you slice into it, it won't kind of round in on itself as much. So that's a pretty important step to make sure you're doing as you're trimming out and adding little details. Also be mindful, you have to sometimes go back in and do a little bit of cleanup. So as I'm cutting in these long lines, you might see towards the end I'll end up having to trim off a little bit extra or just kind of straighten it up. And that's what this is all about. You just have to go back and forth. Now, this is a tip. I've not really talked about this so much, but when you want to make circular shapes, which you're going to probably do on guns and other technical objects, is go ahead and buy a bunch of different size hollow brass tubes or brass rods. Brass rods are good too, but the tubes are generally what I'm mostly using. And what you can do is you can leave them as they are, or what I did is I actually filed them out some to make the edge of the tube much smaller, thinner, and sharper, and that just allows you to make these really nice, perfectly circular shapes in the putty just by pressing it in. You can use it to cut out circles, in which case you just trim off the excess, or you can press it into larger areas of putty just to create a circular shape. And you can get some really cool effects by having multiple sizes of those, to where you start with a larger one and then get a smaller one and press that on the inside of the larger circle, and so on and so forth. And you can get a lot of neat depth and definition that way. So here I'm just continuing to refine the shape. I put a little bit of an angle just to create some extra depth on that upper piece there, and just kind of cutting it into more of an interesting shape based on the kind of rough concept I was following for this, and just constantly going back and forth. And typically when I'm sculpting guns, the #1 tool I'm using is going to be the X-Acto blade and the Scalpel. Having those really sharp, long, straight tools are really important in working with these mechanical shapes on rifles and other guns. But as you can see, I use a color shaper. Any tool at your disposal you should be ready to use. It's just, with technical stuff, you're going to end up doing a lot of hard straight lines. Now you can see there, this is another technique. Now this is a similar principle that I was talking about with the brass tubes, but in this case it's actually, I just took a mechanical pencil. That black one you saw me using is a 0.9 millimeter lead pencil, and what I did with that is you get a little bit of putty on your thumb and you make sure the inside of the tube is lubricated, and then you can press down and kind of rip off the putty, and there's a little bit of it sticking in there, and then you stick it on your miniature. And that's a neat way to create like studs and stuff. Now as you see here, I did one side, and it's really easy to do the other side. You just do it, touch it, and there it is, like magic. Nah, just kidding. I had to work really hard and long to make it symmetrical. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of sculpt rifles in 2 stages. I usually do kind of, 2 stages of the sculpting, the actual detailing. And once that first part is dry, I let it completely cure. I go ahead and clean up any little excess parts. Like here, I'm filing the handle just to make it more of a rounded, contoured shape, and a couple other areas I'll touch up. But once this is all cured, you can go ahead and basically you're going to do the same thing again. You're just going to add more details, but this time it'll be details on top. And you can do this all in one go if you want, if you feel confident that way. But I find it at least for me, it's a lot easier to kind of set up some of the major details, maybe things that lie underneath, and then go back afterwards with some extra putty and start sculpting that on top of it, especially if it's going to be things like if there's more of a casing around the rifle or other elements where they're going to cover up some or contact a lot of the points that you would be sculpting underneath. It seems like it's much easier to control the putty this way. If you do it all at once, it's very easy to damage that fragile detail underneath. So I usually just stick to it this way. So on this gun, the main kind of outer casing and stuff is all going to be on top and wrapping around to the side. And what's cool about this, at least, you still have to try and watch and make sure things are symmetrical, but you can kind of work both sides at the same time, which can be very helpful and sometimes a little easier to make things symmetrical. I want to say don't be super critical and caught up if things aren't perfectly symmetrical. As you sculpt this stuff more, you'll get better you'll get a better eye for symmetry and matching details and stuff like that. So, but remember, you're typically only going to see one side of the gun at a time. And in a lot of cases on miniatures, depending how the character is holding the rifle, they might have one side of it completely pressed up against their body, which I still encourage you to sculpt the entire gun freeform like this, because it's good practice, one, and two, you have a completely usable bit. You can cast this up multiple times or just reuse it. You know, maybe you sculpt a miniature, mold it, you can rip this off the original, put it on a new miniature, and if you've sculpted the entire rifle, that gives you the opportunity and ability to use it in any way you want, and you won't be limited by the fact that maybe you didn't sculpt all the details because you knew in this initial miniature it would be a certain element would be completely covered up. And just as before, you know, go ahead and set this aside for 5 or 10 minutes once you kind of get everything into shape. Do some more little refinements here and there, and then you can go in and start cutting in kind of your final details. Also, don't worry if you have a little bit of, like in this, I think I was a little lacking on some material in certain spots. You can always just put on a little extra putty here and there, you know, blend it in, and just take your time and try and get things to match up as best as possible. So let's see. So I'm cutting in a couple different shapes here, and then I think I'm about to cut in some vents on the side of the gun. And in order to do that, what I do, I love using my Scalpel for that. And what I do is I kind of pick the angle I want them to go at, and I press the tip of the Scalpel in on one end to kind of start it. And then when you do that, you'll notice that the line kind of has a nice hard point at one end and then trails off. Well, then you just have to press in on the other end of the vent, and then you've got two nice divots at the end, and then the lines kind of meet in the middle, and it's just a nice way to get an evenly spaced, crisp line. It's just, oh, it's one of my favorite things to sculpt on guns. Now it's time for the finishing touches. All the main details on the under kind of the first layer details and then the outer casing details are done, but it wasn't quite as crisp as I wanted it to be for a rifle. So I'm going back over after it's completely cured and just taking my files and just very carefully, very gently filing it down, and even going back in with the Scalpel and just kind of scraping it. And in order to scrape, what you do with that is you just take your Scalpel or your X-Acto knife and you kind of point the blade away from the direction you're going to drag the knife, and that will just trim off a little bit of material very carefully, and you can get really nice sharp edges. And the reason I do that sometimes rather than just filing is when you file, you have a tendency to roll the file, and without thinking about it, you can either have the file be lopsided, so you have kind of a slope, or even worse, you might actually get a bit of a roundedness going on. When you drag and scrape with a knife, it will slice exactly where you lay down. So the last little detail I'm going to put on this thing is on the front. I'm going to make a little, I guess for lack of a better term, the barrel, the nozzle, where the bullets or blasts will come out. And for that, you can see me using a brass rod again. I just press down a little bit of putty, and then press the brass rod, trim off the excess, and I'll put on one more right there. And you don't have to use brass rods in order to create these perfect circles. You actually can just form them yourself, but it is just a super awesome and easy tool to get some really crisp, defined shapes. And press it in for the finishing touch, and there we go. And here you can see the completed rifle mounted on a finished miniature. This is a dwarf that I sculpted for my son, and I'm really glad, a sci-fi dwarf, I'm really glad he asked me to do this for him, because it's just not something that I would have done and without him asking. So it was very neat to challenge myself and do some different things in a special character, and especially to be able to sculpt a sci-fi rifle that I might not have ever gotten the chance to do. Now that you've seen these techniques, I hope you'll go ahead and start sculpting some of your own rifles, or even other pieces of technical equipment. I'd like to say a huge thank you to my patrons for helping make this video possible. If you'd like to help support the Mini Sculpting Super Show, head on over there yourself and check it out. Or leave a comment and we can continue the conversation. But if nothing else, remember, keep sculpting.